Getting into this first discussion, again, I really did not think that we were ever going to talk about this, but y'all remember Derek Chauvin. Now, Derek Chauvin is sentenced to prison for about 22 and a half years, and it's because of everything that happened in 2020 with George Floyd. His mugshot is so frightening to me and so menacing. Like, that man just looks like he has been through it. It's giving sleep paralysis demon low key. Uh, but Derek Chauvin, not a laughing matter. This is the man who has been in prison because of everything that happened with George Floyd. Now, I really shouldn't even have to rehash to you guys just how chaotic that is, even though I do feel like people have kind of put rose-colored lenses on when they look at how chaotic and messy 2020 was with BLM and the Summer of Love. But if you don't know by now, there were so many factors of that situation that were completely overlooked and that people did not want to talk about, and you weren't allowed to talk about online for many, many years. Not only would you get canceled, but a lot of the times you would be deplatformed. Now, at this point, if you don't know most of this information that I'm about to say, then you really just need to catch up. Like, facts. George Floyd had fatal levels of fentanyl in his system. Fact. George Floyd said that he could not breathe before he was even on the ground. He was still in the car saying that he could not breathe. Fact. George Floyd had two pre-existing heart conditions that made it extremely likely for him to have just go into cardiac arrest at pretty much any time. In fact, the autopsy showed that there was no evidence of airway destruction or strangulation that was a direct cause of death. So with all of this going on, plus you factor in the heightened emotion that was around this case and people making it into a race war, and even though there was truly not anything to prove that this situation was racially motivated, it still led to the chaos that we know of BLM, which is an organization I am so sick of talking about. I feel like every time I hear BLM, I just want to melt away and just go to a different decade, because they are just so over and done with. But they are potentially going to make a renaissance with this new movement that is going on, where people are calling to pardon Derek Chauvin. And with all the things that I just said and all the factors that I just said, I don't really think much of any of those were considered in the courtroom, at least not to the extent that they arguably should have been. But shout out to Ben Shapiro. He had a take on this that I thought was interesting, and he is one of the people who is spearheading the movement as far as pardoning Derek Chauvin. So I want you guys to hear Ben in his own words.
If we are issuing pardons, however, there is one person that President Trump should pardon from federal charges forthwith. It would be incredibly controversial, but I think that it's absolutely necessary. That person is Derek Chauvin. President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should. He should pardon him his federal charges. If we are talking about reversing the evils of the last several years in American life, obviously COVID and its handling was a massive evil. Destroyed the economy, set us on a path to fiscal insanity, destroyed children, led to massive health-related cover-ups, just horrifying all the way around. And President Trump has taken on a lot of those things. But when it came to BLM, the inciting event for the BLM riots that caused $2 billion in property damage in the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in my lifetime, was in fact the railroading of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. The evidence demonstrates that Derek Chauvin did not, in fact, commit murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was high on fentanyl. He had a significant pre-existing heart condition. George Floyd was saying he could not breathe before he was even out of the car. He was in the car saying he could not breathe. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of even the tape that was shown, had his knee on George Floyd's shoulder or back, not on his neck. The autopsy of George Floyd showed that he had no damage to his trachea, that probably George Floyd died of excited delirium. There were no accusations, even at trial, that Derek Chauvin had committed a hate crime against George Floyd or that he targeted George Floyd because of his race. Nonetheless, on the basis of extraordinarily scanty evidence, and despite the fact that there was massive pressure on the jury.
So those are the words straight from Ben Shapiro, who is leading a petition of getting Trump to pardon George Floyd. Not George Floyd, Derek Chauvin. And now, with all due respect, I disagree. And what we're not going to tolerate, I don't want to hear any Ben Shapiro slander. Don't do too much. don't do too much, because we're allowed to disagree. I align with Ben Shapiro on a lot of things, but I don't align with him on this. And I have a number of reasons why. And this is, again, why I want to hear what you guys have to say. So don't do too much on Ben now. I'm seeing Ben in a few weeks. That's my friend. So, so first thing I want to say again, if you don't know all the information that Ben Shapiro just said, then you really need to catch up. I'm sorry, you are way too far behind. And, I would say at this point, just only look forward to the future. But there are certain basic things of our recent history that I feel like people need to know the truth about. Otherwise, there's going to be this attempt to rewrite history that I am not having. So when it comes to this whole situation, first of all, this is bad PR for the entire right, let alone Trump. But this is bad PR for everybody involved, because this messaging is basically saying that we are about to go back to 2020 after making all this talk about how we're ready to move forward, going back to 2020 and re-sparking the whole conversation about Derek Chauvin, about George Floyd, and all these different factors that I thought that we were already beyond. Now, here's the thing, too, is a lot of people are not fully educated on what happened with George Floyd. But even that, at the bare minimum, you have to admit Derek Chauvin was a reckless police officer. He's not a good cop. He doesn't have a good record. His record is actually very, very terrible. He should have had his badge taken away a long time ago. And although it is a fact that there was no proof of strangulation, there's a clear lack of regard that Derek Chauvin had for George Floyd's life at that point. So while I don't think that Derek is necessarily guilty of all the different elements of that situation, he at the very, very least was a very reckless police officer. Now, pushing to pardon him is also an interesting debate in the sense that it does nothing. There's literally no net benefit to it. And the reason I say that is because President Trump's power is able to pardon him in a federal sense. And Derek Chauvin's sentencing is about 21 years federal, but it's 22 and a half years in state sentencing. So even if President Trump today went and pardoned Derek Chauvin still would have to remain in prison for the rest of his term because of his state sentencing. That 22 and a half year sentence is longer. And honestly, he'd probably end up in a worse situation if he was pardoned federally, because if he goes to a state prison, that means he's going back to Minnesota, which we know is under the ruling of Tim Walz. And you know good and well that Tim Walz is not about to let Derek Chauvin out of prison anytime soon. So if he goes to a state prison, he is probably going to be more unprotected. So I don't really see a net benefit in trying to pardon him. I understand what Ben is saying, that it would right some of the wrongs and kind of show that this is a new beginning and that we're not about to tolerate racial division and all of that. But honestly, I feel like this would be reopening a wound in a way that it would create so much more racial division that we are starting to finally heal from. I feel like this would knock us many steps back. To be specific, I think it would knock us 5 years back. And America just can't afford to do that right now. Instead of pardoning Derek Chauvin, how about we build a border wall first? How about we end the wars that are overseas that we have our foot in first? How about we figure out what Diddy was doing first? There's so many things that we could be doing in America first, rather than worrying about Derek Chauvin and just basically giving him the validation of, oh, you're not as bad of a guy as we thought as a country, but you still have to remain in prison for 22 and a half years. There really, to me, just is no net positive to this whole situation. It is interesting. I understand what Ben is saying, and no Ben Shapiro slander. Don't do too much. Do not do too much. But yeah, I just don't see it being something that's worth diving too deeply into.